Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we're going to continue our reading of Whose Body?, the first of the Lord Peter Wimsey mysteries by Dorothy L. Sayers. We pick up in the middle of a coroner's inquest about the mysterious body which has appeared in a bath and which may or may not, but actually is not and is known to be not, that of Sir Reuben Levy, a financier who has disappeared mysteriously on the same night. Dr. Grimbold corroborated his distinguished colleague Sir Julian in every particular, except that, in his opinion, death had not occurred for several days after the blow. It was with the greatest hesitancy that he ventured to differ from Sir Julian Freak, and he might be wrong. It was difficult to tell in any case, and when he saw the body, deceased had been dead at least 24 hours, in his opinion. Inspector Sugg recalled. Would he tell the jury what steps had been taken to identify the deceased? A description had been sent to every police station and had been inserted in all the newspapers. In view of the suggestion made by Sir Julian Freak, had inquiries been made at all the seaports? They had. And with no results? With no results at all. No one had come forward to identify the body? Plenty of people had come forward, but nobody had succeeded in identifying it. Had any effort been made to follow up the clue afforded by the eyeglasses? Inspector Sugg submitted that, having regard to the interests of justice, he would beg to be excused from answering that question. Might the jury see the eyeglasses? The eyeglasses were handed to the jury. William Watts, called, confirmed the evidence of Sir Julian Freak with regard to the dissecting room subjects. He explained the system by which they were entered. They usually were supplied by the workhouses and free hospitals. They were under his sole charge. The young gentleman could not possibly get the keys. Had Sir Julian Freak or any of the house surgeons the keys? No, not even Sir Julian Freak. The keys had remained in his possession on Monday night? They had. And in any case, the inquiry was irrelevant as there was no body missing, nor ever had been. That was the case. The coroner then addressed the jury, reminding them with some asperity that they were not there to gossip about who the deceased could or could not have been, but to give their opinion as to the cause of death. He reminded them that they should consider whether, according to the medical evidence, death could have been accidental or self-inflicted, or whether it was deliberate murder or homicide. If they considered the evidence on this point insufficient, they could return an open verdict. In any case, their verdict could not prejudice any person. If they brought in murder, the whole evidence would have to be gone through again before the magistrate. He then dismissed them with the unspoken adjuration to be quick about it. Sir Julian Freak, after giving his evidence, had caught the eye of the Duchess and now came over and greeted her. "I haven't seen you for an age," said that lady. "How are you?" "Hard at work," said the specialist. "Just got my new book out. This kind of thing wastes time. Have you seen Lady Levy yet?" "No, poor dear," said the Duchess. "I only came up this morning for this. Mrs. Thipps is staying with me, one of Peter's eccentricities, you know. Poor Christine. I must run round and see her. This is Mr. Parker," she added, "who is investigating that case." "Oh," said Sir Julian, and paused. "Do you know," he said in a low voice to Parker, "I'm very glad to meet you. Have you seen Lady Levy yet?" "I saw her this morning." "Did she ask you to go on with the inquiry?" "Yes," said Parker. "She thinks," he added, "that Sir Reuben may be detained in the hands of some financial rival, or that perhaps some scoundrels are holding him to ransom." "And is that your opinion?" asked Sir Julian. "I think it very likely," said Parker frankly. Sir Julian hesitated. "I wish you would walk back with me when this is over," he said. "I should be delighted," said Parker. At this moment the jury returned and took their places, and there was a little rustle and hush. The coroner addressed the foreman and inquired if they were agreed upon their verdict. "We are agreed, Mr. Coroner, that deceased died of the effects of a blow upon the spine, but how that injury was inflicted we consider that there is not sufficient evidence to show." Mr. Parker and Sir Julian Freak walked up the road together. "I had absolutely no idea until I saw Lady Levy this morning," said the doctor, "that there was any idea of connecting this matter with the disappearance of Sir Reuben. The suggestion was perfectly monstrous and could only have grown up in the mind of that ridiculous police officer. If I had had any idea what was in his mind, I could have disabused him and avoided all this." "I did my best to do so," said Parker, "as soon as I was called into the Levy case." "Who called you in, if I may ask?" inquired Sir Julian. Well, the household, first of all, and then Sir Reuben's uncle, Mr. Levy of Portman Square, wrote to me to go on with the investigation. And now Lady Levy has confirmed those instructions? Certainly, said Peter Parker in some surprise. Sir Julian was silent for a little time. I'm afraid I was the person to put the idea into Suggs' head, said Parker rather penitently. When Sir Reuben disappeared, my first step almost was to hunt up all the street accidents and suicides and so on that had turned up during the day, and I went down to see this Battersea Park body as a matter of routine. Of course, I saw that the thing was ridiculous as soon as I got there, but Sugg froze on to the idea, and it's true there was a good deal of resemblance between the dead man and the portraits I've seen of Sir Reuben. A strong superficial likeness, said Sir Julian. The upper part of the face is not an uncommon type, and Sir Reuben wore a heavy beard, and there was no opportunity of comparing the mouths and chins. I can understand how the idea occurred to someone, but only to be dismissed at once. I'm sorry, he added, as the whole matter has been painful to Lady Levy. You may know, Mr. Parker, that I'm an old, though I should not call myself an intimate, friend of the Levys. I understood something of the sort. Yes, when I was a young man, In short, Mr. Parker, I hoped once to marry Lady Levy. Mr. Parker gave the usual sympathetic groan. I have never married, as you know, pursued Sir Julian. We have remained good friends. I have always done what I could to spare her pain. Believe me, Sir Julian, said Parker, that I sympathize very much with you and with Lady Levy, and that I did all I could to disabuse Inspector Sugg of this notion. Unhappily, the coincidence of Sir Reuben's being seen that evening in the Battersea Park Road— yes, said Sir Julian. Dear me, here we are at home. Perhaps you would come in for a moment, Mr. Parker, and have tea or a whiskey and soda or something? Parker promptly accepted this invitation, feeling that there were other things to be said. The two men stepped into a square, finely furnished hall with a fireplace on the same side as the door and a staircase opposite. The dining-room door stood open on their right, and as Sir Julian rang the bell, a manservant appeared at the far end of the hall. "What will you take?" asked the doctor. "After that dreadful cold place," said Parker, "what I really want is gallons of hot tea, if you as a nerve specialist can bear the thought of it." "Provided you allow a judicious blend of china in it," replied Sir Julian in the same tone, "I have no objection to make. Tea in the library at once," he added to the servant, and led the way upstairs. "I don't use the downstairs rooms much, except the dining room," he explained as he ushered his guest into a small but cheerful library on the first floor. "This room leads out of my bedroom and is much more convenient. I only live part of my time here, but it's very handy for my research work at the hospital. That's what I do there mostly. It's a fatal thing for a theorist, Mr. Parker, to let the practical work get behindhand. Dissection is the basis of all good theory and all correct diagnosis. One must keep one's hand and eye in training. This place is far more important to me than Harley Street, and someday I shall abandon my consulting practice altogether and settle down here to cut up my subjects and write my books in peace. So many things in this life are a waste of time, Mr. Parker." Mr. Parker assented to this. "Very often," said Sir Julian, "the only time I get for any research work, necessitating as it does the keenest observation and the faculties at their acutest, has to be at night after a long day's work, and by artificial light, which, magnificent as the lighting of the dissecting room here is always more trying to the eyes than daylight. Doubtless your own work has to be carried on under even more trying conditions." "Yes, sometimes," said Parker, "but then you see," he added, "the conditions are, so to speak, part of the work." Quite so," said Sir Julian. "You mean that the burglar, for example, does not demonstrate his methods in the light of day, or plant the perfect footmark in the middle of a damp patch of sand for you to analyze." "Not as a rule," said the detective, "but I have no doubt many of your diseases work quite as insidiously as any burglar." They do," said Sir Julian, laughing, "and it is my pride, as it is yours, to track them down for the good of society. The neuroses, you know, are particularly clever criminals. They break out into as many disguises as Leon Kestrel, the master mummer," suggested Parker, who read railway stall detective stories on the principle of the busman's holiday. No doubt," said Sir Julian, who did not. "They cover up their tracks wonderfully. But when you can really investigate, Mr. Parker, and break up the dead, or for preference the living body with the scalpel, you always find the footmarks, a little trail of ruin or disorder left by madness or disease or drink or any other similar pest. But the difficulty is to trace them back merely by observing the surface symptoms, the hysteria, crime, religion, fear, shyness, conscience, or whatever it may be. Just as you observe a theft or a murder and look for the footsteps of the criminal, so I observe a fit of hysterics or an outburst of piety and hunt for the little mechanical irritation which has produced it. You regard all these things as physical? Undoubtedly. I am not ignorant of the rise of another school of thought, Mr. Parker, but its exponents are mostly charlatans or self-deceivers. Sie haben sich so weit darin enheiligest, that, like Sludge the Medium, they are beginning to believe their own nonsense. I should like to have the exploring of some of their brains, Mr. Parker. I would show you the little faults and landslips in the cells, the misfiring and short-circuiting of the nerves which produce these notions in these books. At least, he added, gazing somberly at his guest, at least, if I could not quite show you today, I shall be able to do so tomorrow, or in a year's time, or before I die. He sat for some minutes, gazing into the fire, while the red light played upon his tawny beard and struck out answering gleams from his compelling eyes. Parker drank tea in silence, watching him. On the whole, however, he remained but little interested in the causes of nervous phenomena, and his mind strayed to Lord Peter, coping with the redoubtable Cripplesham down in Salisbury. Lord Peter had wanted him to come. That meant either that Cripplesham was proving recalcitrant, or that a clue wanted following. But Bunter had said that tomorrow would do, and it was just as well. After all, the Battersea affair was not Parker's case. He had already wasted valuable time attending to an inconclusive inquest, and he really ought to get on with his legitimate work. There was still Levy's secretary to see, and the little matter of the Peruvian oil to be looked into. He looked at his watch. "I'm very much afraid, if you will excuse me," he murmured. Sir Julian came back with a start to the consideration of actuality. "Your work calls you?" he said, smiling. "Well, I can understand that. I won't keep you. But I wanted to say something to you in connection with your present inquiry. Only I hardly like—" Parker sat down again and banished every indication of hurry from his face and attitude. "I shall be very grateful for any help you can give me," he said. "I'm afraid it's more in the nature of a hindrance," said Sir Julian with a short laugh. "It's a case of destroying a clue for you and a breach of professional confidence on my side. But since, accidentally, a certain amount has come out, perhaps the whole had better do so." Mr. Parker made the encouraging noise which among laymen supplies the place of the priest's insinuating, "Yes, my son." "Sir Reuben Levy visited me on Monday night," said Sir Julian. "Yes," said Parker without expression. "He found cause for certain grave suspicions concerning his health," said Sir Julian slowly, as though weighing how much he could in honor disclose to a stranger. "He came to me in preference to his own medical man, as he was particularly anxious that the matter should be kept from his wife. As I told you, he knew me fairly well, and Lady Levy had consulted me about a nervous disorder in the summer." "Did he make an appointment with you?" asked Parker. "I beg your pardon?" said the other absently. "Did he make an appointment?" "An appointment? Oh, no. He turned up suddenly in the evening after dinner when I wasn't expecting him. I took him up here and examined him, and he left me somewhere around 10 o'clock, I should think." "May I ask what was the result of your examination?" "Why do you want to know?" "It might illuminate, conjecture as to his subsequent conduct," said Parker cautiously. This story seemed to have little coherence with the rest of the business, and he wondered whether coincidence alone was responsible for Sir Reuben's disappearance on the same night that he had visited the doctor. "I see," said Sir Julian. "Yes, well, I will tell you in confidence that I saw grave grounds of suspicion, but as yet no absolute certainty of mischief." "Thank you. Sir Reuben left you at 10 o'clock? "Then, or thereabouts. I did not at first mention the matter, as it was so very much Sir Reuben's wish to keep his visit to me secret. And there was no question of accident in the street, or anything of that kind, since he reached home safely at midnight." "Quite so," said Parker. "It would have been, and is, a breach of confidence," said Sir Julian, "and I only tell you now because Sir Reuben was accidentally seen, and because I would rather tell you in private than have you ferreting round here and questioning my servants, Mr. Parker. You will excuse my frankness." "Certainly," said Parker. "I hold no brief for the pleasantness of my profession, Sir Julian. I am very much obliged to you for telling me this. I might otherwise have wasted valuable time following up a false trail." "I am sure I need not ask you in your turn to respect this confidence," said the doctor. "To publish the matter abroad could only harm Sir Reuben and pain his wife, besides placing me in no very favorable light with my patients." "I promise to keep the thing to myself," said Parker, "except, of course," he added hastily, "that I must inform my colleague." "You have a colleague in the case?" "I have." "What sort of person is he?" "He will be perfectly discreet, Sir Julian." "Is he a police officer?" "You need not be afraid of your confidence getting into the records at Scotland Yard." "I see that you know how to be discreet too, Mr. Parker." "We also have our professional etiquette, Sir Julian." On returning to Great Ormond Street, Mr. Parker found a wire awaiting him which said, "Do not trouble to come, all well, returning tomorrow, Wimsey." Chapter 7, in which Lord Peter's mother has occasion to meet Mr. Milligan from Chicago, and Lord Peter had not told her he was coming. On returning to the flat just before lunchtime on the following morning, after a few confirmatory researches in Balham and the neighborhood of Victoria Station, Lord Peter was greeted at the door by Mr. Bunter, who had gone straight home from Waterloo, with a telephone message and a severe and nursemaid-like eye. "Lady Swaffham rang up, my lord, and said she hoped your lordship had not forgotten you were lunching with her." "I have forgotten, Bunter, and I mean to forget. I trust you told her I had succumbed to lethargic encephalitis, suddenly, no flowers by request." "Lady Swaffham said, my lord, she was counting on you. She met the Duchess of Denver yesterday. If my sister-in-law's there, I won't go, and that's flat," said Lord Peter. "I beg your pardon, my lord, the Dowager Duchess." "What's she doing in town?" "I imagine she came up for the inquest, my lord." "Oh, yes, we missed that, Bunter." "Yes, my lord. Her Grace is lunching with Lady Swaffham?" "Bunter, I can't really. Say I'm in bed with whooping cough and ask my mother to come round after lunch." "Very well, my lord. Mrs. Tommy Frail will be at Lady Swaffham's, my lord, and Mr. Milligan." "Mr. who?" "Mr. John P. Milligan, my lord." "Good God, Bunter, why didn't you say so before? Have I time to get there before he does? All right, I'm off. With a taxi I can just—" "Not in those trousers, my lord," said Mr. Bunter, blocking the way to the door with deferential firmness. "Oh, Bunter," pleaded his lordship, "do let me just this once. You don't know how important it is." "Not on any account, my lord. It would be as much as my place is worth." "The trousers are all right, Bunter." "Not for Lady Swaffham's, my lord. Besides, your lordship forgets the man that ran against you with a milk can at Salisbury." And Mr. Bunter laid an accusing finger on a slight stain of grease showing across the light cloth. "I wish to God I'd never let you grow into a privileged family retainer, Bunter," said Lord Peter bitterly, dashing his walking stick into the umbrella stand. "You've no conception of the mistakes my mother may be making." Mr. Bunter smiled grimly and led his victim away. When the immaculate Lord Peter was ushered rather late for lunch into Lady Swaffham's drawing-room, the Dowager Duchess of Denver was seated on the sofa, plunged in intimate conversation with Mr. John P. Milligan of Chicago. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Duchess," had been the financier's opening remark, "to thank you for your exceedingly kind invitation. I assure you it's a compliment I deeply appreciate." The Duchess beamed at him while conducting a rapid rally of all her intellectual forces. "Do come and sit down and talk to me, Mr. Milligan," she said. "I do so love talking to you great businessmen. Let's see, is it a railway king you are, or something about Puss in the Corner? At least, I don't mean that exactly, but that game one used to play with cards, all about wheat and oats, and there was a bull and a bear, too, or was it a horse? No, a bear, I remember, because one always had to try and get rid of it, and it used to get so dreadfully crumpled and torn, poor thing, always being handed about. One got to recognize it, and then one had to buy a new pack. So foolish it must seem to you, knowing the real thing, and dreadfully noisy, but really excellent for breaking the ice with rather stiff people who didn't know each other. I'm quite sorry it's gone out." Mr. Milligan sat down. "Well now," he said, "I guess it's as interesting for us businessmen to meet British aristocrats as it is for Britishers to meet American railway kings, Duchess. And I guess I'll make as many mistakes talking your kind of talk as you would make if you were trying to run a corner in wheat in Chicago." Fancy now, I called that fine lad of yours Lord Wimsey the other day, and he thought I'd mistaken him for his brother. That made me feel rather green." This was an unhoped-for lead. The Duchess walked warily. "Dear boy," she said, "I am so glad you met him, Mr. Milligan. Both my sons are a great comfort to me, you know, though of course Gerald is more conventional, just the right kind of person for the House of Lords, you know, and a splendid farmer. I can't see Peter down at Denver half so well, though he is always going to all the right things in town and very amusing sometimes, poor boy." "I was very much gratified by Lord Peter's suggestion," pursued Mr. Milligan. "For what I understand you are responsible, and I'll surely be very pleased to come any day you like, though I think you're flattering me too much." "Ah, well," said the Duchess, "I don't know if you're the best judge of that, Mr. Milligan. Not that I know anything about business myself," she added. "I'm rather old-fashioned for these days, you know, and I can't pretend to do more than know a nice man when I see him. For the other things I rely on my son." The accent of this speech was so flattering that Mr. Milligan purred almost audibly and said, "Well, Duchess, I guess that's where a lady with a real beautiful old-fashioned soul has the advantage of these modern young blatherskites. There aren't many men who wouldn't be nice to her, and even then, if they aren't rock-bottom, she can see through them." "But that leaves me where I was," thought the Duchess. "I believe," she said aloud, "that I ought to be thanking you in the name of the Vicar of Dukes Denver for a very munificent check which reached him yesterday for the Church Restoration Fund. He was so delighted and astonished, poor dear man." "Oh, that's nothing," said Mr. Milligan. "We haven't any fine old crusted buildings like yours over on our side, so it's a privilege to be allowed to drop a little kerosene into the wormholes when we hear of one in the old country suffering from senile decay. So when your lad told me about Dukes Denver, I took the liberty to subscribe without waiting for the bazaar." "I'm sure it was very kind of you," said the Duchess. "You are coming to the bazaar, then?" she continued, gazing into his face appealingly. "Sure thing," said Mr. Milligan with great promptness. "Lord Peter said you'd let me know for sure about the date, but we can always make time for a little bit of good work anyway. Of course, I'm hoping to be able to avail myself of your kind invitation to stop, but if I'm rushed, I'll manage anyhow to pop over and speak my piece and pop back again." "I hope so very much," said the Duchess. "I must see what can be done about the date. Of course, I can't promise—" "No, no," said Mr. Milligan heartily. "I know what these things are to fix up. And then there's not only me, there's all the really big men of European eminence your son mentioned to be consulted." The Duchess turned pale at the thought that any one of the illustrious persons might sometime turn up in somebody's drawing-room, but by this time she had dug herself in comfortably and was even beginning to find her range. "I can't say how grateful we are to you," she said. "It will be such a treat. Do tell me what you think of saying." "Well," began Mr. Milligan. Suddenly everybody was standing up, and a penitent voice was heard to say, "Really, most awfully sorry, you know. Hope you'll forgive me, Lady Swaffham. What? Dear lady, could I possibly forget an invitation from you? Fact is, I had to go and see a man down in Salisbury. Absolutely true, 'pon my word. And the fellow wouldn't let me get away. I'm simply groveling before you, Lady Swaffham. Shall I go and eat my lunch in the corner?" Lady Swaffham forgave the culprit gracefully. "Your mother is here," she said. "How do, mother?" said Lord Peter uneasily. "How are you, dear?" replied the Duchess. "You really oughtn't to have turned up just yet. Mr. Milligan was just going to tell me what a thrilling speech he's preparing for the bazaar when you came and interrupted us." Conversation at lunch turned, not unnaturally, on the Battersea inquest, the Duchess giving a vivid impersonation of Mrs. Thipps being interrogated by the coroner. "Did you hear anything unusual in the night?" says the little man, leaning forward and screaming at her, and so crimson in the face, and his ears sticking out so, just like a cherubim in that poem of Tennyson's, or is a cherub blue? Perhaps it's a seraphim, I mean. Anyway, you know what I mean, all eyes with little wings on the head. And dear old Mrs. Phipps saying, "Of course I have, any time these 80 years. And such a sensation in court they found out, until she found out she thought he'd said, 'Do you sleep without a light?' and everybody laughing. And then the coroner said quite loudly, 'Damn the woman,' and she heard that, I can't think why, and said, 'Don't you get swearing, young man, sitting there in the presence of Providence, as you may say. I don't know what you young people are coming to nowadays.' And he's 60 if he's a day, you know," said the Duchess. And we will continue with the dinner conversation next time.